As you all know, we have learned that it is very risky to make predictions, especially about the future. So why on earth would someone join an industry whose business is to make predictions? Mrs. Jayme Rubin is one of those who does it. And she is recognized by her clients as one whose greatest strength is her ability to ascertain what's around the next corner. I also think that Mrs. Rubin is uniquely qualified to analyze and predict the future because she has a degree in history. And in my mind, those who know history have the ability to look into the future. And what lies ahead of us in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries, Mrs. Rubin will tell us all about it.
Today, I'm going to talk about three topics. The first is, really the major topic I'm here to discuss is, the challenges facing the pharmaceutical industry, how we got where we are, how so much value has been lost, and is there a future? Can this industry thrive again? And this is an industry that's been through lots of ups and downs, but it's also one of the few industries that has continued to refurbish itself. Very few industries can say that. The automobile industry, so many industries have become sunset industries and have been virtually extinguished. But the pharmaceutical industry, because of R&D cycles, has been able to reinvent itself decades after decades. But the last 10 years have been quite difficult. And as Dr. Keshanover beautifully illustrated, the drug discovery process has been through several different revolutions, and I would argue that the industry is really struggling to go from the second revolution to the third revolution. And one of the things he said that I thought was interesting was how the first wave of drugs were really developed through serendipity, the second wave of drugs through high-throughput screening, but there are a lot of drugs that were developed over the last 10 years that were also developed through serendipity. You're all familiar with Viagra. Viagra was originally developed as a heart drug, and they noticed during clinical trials another side effect. And it was because of that other side effect that Viagra became a billion-dollar drug. This is kind of a depressing chart. I'm sure many of you have owned pharmaceutical stocks over the last 10 years, and they haven't done very well. But this will show you that back in 2000, pharmaceutical companies at one point represented over 60% of the value of healthcare companies. And that was about close to $1 trillion in value. Today, that value has shrunk to only 26%. And these are the industries that's actually gained value during that time. The med tech industry has grown 116%. Managed care companies have grown during that period of time. Supply chain companies such as distributors and PBMs, generic pharmaceutical companies, a big chunk of that value right there is Teva Pharmaceuticals, which 20 years ago was a rinky-dink company. I remember coming to Israel 25 years ago and visiting Teva, and they were a very small company, and today they are eating Pfizer's lunch. So, in the biotech industry also, which we don't include in here because of Genentech, but the biotech industry has also added about $100 billion in value. But during this time, the drug industry has lost $600 billion in value. Overall, healthcare has actually shrunk in market cap because of what has happened to pharmaceuticals. So let's discuss the challenges. Many of the challenges facing the industry were problems that the industry brought upon itself. I mean, frankly, the 1990s were a spectacular period for the industry. And the companies got big and fat and lazy. And as a result, the companies are facing many of the challenges today. I'm going to run through these quickly, and as I'm sure many of you are familiar. Over the past 10 years, the industry has spent close to $300 billion in R&D spending and have very little to show for it. In fact, the previous decade, in the 1990s, the industry spent less than half of what it spent over the last 10 years. And as you know, the 1990s produced dozens of blockbuster drugs: Lipitor, Zyprexa, Fosamax, Celebrex, Viagra. And over this past 10 years, most of the blockbuster drugs have actually come from the biotech industry, not the pharmaceutical industry. And this is an interesting chart because it shows just the differences, what we've seen in terms of new product launches. So the products up here on top were drugs: Zyprexa, Januvia, Cymbalta, Humira, just as an example. of their new product launch curves, when they were introduced to the market, they did very well. On the bottom here, you see about 4 or 5 drugs that have just recently been introduced over the past 12 months, and their launches have been very disappointing. And this is in part because the operating environment, the payer environment, the FDA environment has become so much more restrictive. So not only does it cost a lot more to bring a drug to the marketplace, but then it's much more difficult to generate returns because of the pressures in the market. This is also a chart that you're probably familiar with. The number of FDA approvals has dropped, not dramatically, but fewer new products are getting through the FDA. Why is that? That's because the FDA, since 2004, when Vioxx was withdrawn from the market, the U.S. regulatory authorities are far more concerned about safety. The bar is much higher. It's much more difficult to get a drug through the market today than it was even 5 years ago. And I'm sure also familiar with the patent cliff. The industry faces almost $90 billion in products that are going generic. Lipitor is in 2011, Zyprexa is in 2012. And it's a big problem because $90 billion is about a third of the industry's total revenues. And it's not at all clear how those revenues will be replaced. And this is probably too busy a slide for this audience today, but you can see just how what we tried to depict here was the cycle of research and development. And again, in the early 1990s, you saw this huge increase in R&D productivity. That was a period when, again, R&D spend was about half of what it's been over the last decade, yet that was a period when there was incredible R&D output. Many meaningful products were introduced. They became huge blockbuster drugs. I remember when Lipitor was introduced in 1997, my son was just born. My first year projection for Lipitor was about $300 million, and I was considered high on the street. The company was trying to talk us down. P.S. first year sales were $800 million, and on the eve of its patent expiration, Lipitor sales will be about $12 billion. So this was a period of time when there were numerous new product introductions and products that did very well. Over the past 10 years, it's really hard to pinpoint where those blockbusters have come from, mostly the biotech industry. And now we're facing this period, as you see on the right, where patent expirations will be weighing on top-line sales. And it's not real clear what the next wave of products will be, certainly not in the next 3 or 4 years. And that's the reason why valuations for the industry have come down to a lot. I ask a question here, though, are we at an inflection point for R&D? Indeed, there are numerous exciting new product opportunities which may or may not work, and we will see clinical data released over the next 6 to 24 months in the areas of Alzheimer's, hepatitis C, oncology, etc. And if they work, then R&D will potentially inflect upward. I think what's interesting about this chart, too, is that in the early 1990s, during the Clinton era, when the Clintons were trying to reform healthcare in the U.S., investors were very bleak about the R&D outlook. It's very difficult to predict R&D productivity because you tend to look in the rearview mirror. And in 1993, 1994, we were looking at a period of patent expirations, not as big as what we're experiencing going forward, but at the time they were very big. Tagamet was going generic, Naprosyn, these were big drugs at the time, and nobody could see what was in the pipelines, and pharma stocks came under tremendous pressure because the government was going to take over, and yet what happened was a period of enormous productivity. So, are we at that period today where investors are looking in the rearview mirror and not seeing anything, just seeing 10 years of lost capital? Maybe. I don't think so, but that's just something to think about. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about just among the pressures, the U.S. government has now become the biggest purchaser of prescription drugs. Really, it was with the Medicare, the expansion of Medicare to include prescription drugs in 2007. The government now purchases over 50% of our drugs, and therefore the pressure on pricing has never been greater. And as we look forward to how drugs are priced, drugs pricing will be based on performance and outcomes. It's not enough to show improvements in surrogate endpoints such as LDLs or HbA1c levels in diabetes. You have to now prove that your drug saves lives. And we've now seen that with oncology, where clinical trial studies have moved from measurements that are surrogates to measurements of overall survival. It's not enough to show that the tumor shrinks. You also have to show that a shrinking tumor leads to survival. And that's how drugs now get priced. And it's the same thing with devices. Device pricing is based on ability to remove costs from the system. Laparoscopy, stents, huge step forward with respect to saving money to the system. And that is how pricing will be determined going forward because, again, there are not unlimited resources. So the question is, how is the industry, what are the changes required for the industry to survive? And indeed, will this industry not just survive, but will it thrive again? This chart is a problem. This shows returns on invested capital for the industry. And you see how since the late 1990s, returns have come down. That's because the industry continues to spend with little to show for it. This is the issue that CEOs have to address. And if these stocks are going to work again, we need to see, again, that curve inflecting upward, that the amount of spend is leading to improving returns. So how is that going to happen? The business model has to change. The blockbuster business model of the past is moving away from chronic care, traditional medicines, to specialty medicines or personalized medicine, which still, I think, is many years away. But that's how these companies are trying to change their future. They're trying to increase their exposure to revenues that aren't going to go away through patent expirations, but are there to stay for a longer period of time. Biologics, vaccines, even consumer products, and companies are moving towards a more branded generics kind of model. And the good news is they got plenty of cash to get there. By 2015, the industry will have about $200 billion in cash. There are opportunities in R&D, as I just recently mentioned. These are the areas that the industry is focused in. But as these products are still developing in phase 3 trials, and as we're waiting for personalized medicine to materialize, and it is, I mean, there were very exciting signs at ASCO this past weekend. Oncology drugs that target certain mutations for cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, a Pfizer drug called an ALK inhibitor. There are a BRAF inhibitor for the treatment of melanoma. There are some very exciting breakthroughs in personalized medicine, but we're talking a long, long, long ways away before these products will be meaningful enough to move the industry's dial. So right now, this is a diagram that describes how the industry is thinking about its future. And my sense is that these companies are really going through an identity crisis. They're not really sure what they want to be as they continue to evolve. That the European drug companies are moving as fast away from pharma as they can and buying up consumer, animal health, vaccine businesses. They're also trying to become diversified, like the J&J model. But you know, I sort of look at it as 3 different opportunities for pharma to converge. Pharmaceuticals and biotech companies are converging. In fact, I would argue that biotech is probably converging more closely to pharma, as we've seen companies like Amgen and Gilead and Celgene. Their multiples have come down to pharma as investors realize that, wait a minute, these guys, they're just pharma companies too. But it's interesting because by 2014, 7 out of the top 10 drugs on the market will be biologicals. And I would anticipate that we will continue to see M&A activity between pharma and biotech buying other small biotech, because we're the increasing importance of biotechnology. Pharma is also converging to consumer products companies. And what's interesting here is that Pfizer, which sold their consumer products business to J&J 5 years ago, is now trying to get bigger in consumer products. Why is consumer suddenly so interesting? Because consumer products companies, consumer products never go away. They never get hit by generic competition. They're durable assets. And consumer products companies like J&J, Colgate, P&G, trade at much higher multiples than pharmaceuticals. So the industry, many of these companies are trying to scale up in consumer drugs. I think one of the most interesting trends that we're seeing, and I'm not hugely optimistic that it's going to play out, but the industry is trying to get bigger in emerging markets. And the reason why is because it's the emerging markets, it's the only market in the world that is growing. And you'll see right now emerging markets is about 140 billion. By 2013, that market is expected to be almost as big as the US. And so many of these companies are targeting emerging markets, trying to get bigger in emerging markets in order to supplement the lack of products that they have in the US. And this is a slide that shows just how much money it costs to buy companies in emerging markets. And in fact, we've seen deals this year where emerging markets companies, i.e. Indian drug companies that are generics, are more valuable than biotech companies. And in fact, if you look at the slide, and apologies for it being so busy, but the average BRICS company, i.e. generic company in BRICS markets, fetch multiples or valuations which are higher than biotech. And I would argue that pharmaceutical companies are now seeing these assets as almost, if not more valuable than biotech because it offers them growth and less risk. So I just want to end with a couple of questions. I have to be optimistic on the industry because it's my livelihood, and if the industry is not around, I have nothing to analyze. So I'm optimistic on the industry. But the four questions that I ask are, will biotech companies be differentiated from pharma companies? I don't think they will be. I think that these two sectors are converging, and I think pharma is going to buy biotech, biotech's going to become biotech, and biotech's becoming like pharma. Amgen is a drug company, and I've been trying to convince my research director that I should be able to cover Amgen, not our biotech analysts. And a long time ago, our biotech analysts said, oh, I'd never give up Amgen because it's a biotech company. Now they'd love to give it to me because Amgen trades like not quite as low as Pfizer, but pretty close. Second question is, will generic companies be differentiated from pharma companies? Big chunk of Teva's revenues are prescription drugs, are branded drugs protected with IP. And these companies, the generic drug companies and the pharmaceutical companies, are all competing for the same assets in emerging markets. It's interesting that it was Pfizer competing against Teva for Radiopharm, an emerging markets branded generics company in Germany. Thirdly, without a thriving industry, drug industry, will other sectors, subsectors, continue to survive? Generic companies really rely on a strong pharmaceutical industry to generate their future revenues. That's also true for PBMs, distributors, and CROs. So I hope they're all rooting for a continued strong pharmaceutical sector because 5 years from now, there won't be any generic there won't be products that go generic because you need products, develop products in order for those drugs to eventually go generic. And lastly, my real view is that if these models don't work, the convergence models, will managements decide to unlock value through breaking themselves up? Or will consolidation continue, whereupon there will just be a handful of global players? My view is that we'll see more consolidation in the industry, but for these companies to really unlock value, my view is that they've got to figure out how to get smaller and break themselves up. And in fact, Pfizer, which now trades at about $15 a share, is worth about $25 a share if it breaks itself up into 9 separate companies, which I don't think will ever happen, but it helps you to think about the significant value that lurks underneath these mega behemoths. But CEOs aren't willing yet to think of their companies that way, but rather as empires. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, with that, thank you very much.